Fantastic that we've made it through here, and let's see how our energy levels keep going in this session. We certainly have a fantastic subject, which is how to make Europe a people's project. With Alberto Alemanno starting us off. I'm reminded with this People's Project thing of how important language is. In 1997, Britain got a new Labour government after decades of the Conservatives, so rather similar to the situation now. And when they came in, they were looking for new vocabulary to describe New Labour, Third Way, post-socialist and all of that. So they started calling everything the people's this and the people's that, the people's democracy, the people's government. And then Diana died and they talked about the people's princess. And this was all going really well for them until Robin Cook, the new foreign secretary, went to tour Central Europe, which was kind of a bit unknown territory for Labour at that point. And he arrives in Warsaw and he makes this big speech about people's democracy in Europe. And we want a people's republic of Europe. And these stony-faced Poles stared back at him and he couldn't understand what was wrong. We want a people's democracy. What's wrong with that, guys? So can be a little bit risky, but I'm sure now, here we are, nearly 30 years later, and so the People's Project can come back. And Alberto is a fantastic person to tell us about this. I think you all know him, but I just remind you that in addition to running the Good Lobby, which is a really super initiative, and if you really, really want to know how to do advocacy, you have to go to his summer school, which is very wisely in the north of Spain, very clever. And of course, he's a professor of law and has also done very interesting work on rule of law matters. So he has a very serious academic side in addition to all this advocacy malarkey. And so we're looking forward to hearing your generational account of what Europe has been and should aspire to be. And then we will have Rosa Balfour and Nikola Dimitrov to comment further. So over to you, Alberto.
Thank you, Heather. Hello, everyone. Entitled It was off, yeah. So the project is provisionally entitled That Thing, that was already tested in the UK with limited success. Let's see how it goes. But the starting point of this project is the realization that the European project has been and continues to be the defining experience in the lifetime of my generation, or at least many in that generation, for good or for bad, but it has been defining. And it certainly shaped mine more than anybody else, at least that's what I feel and what I sense, hence the idea to tell you my story. I was born in an industrial town in the north of Italy, Fiat town, grew up in one of the most popular suburbs where migrants from the south of Italy mixed with the local middle class until my late teens. My parents were very politically engaged. They came from the so-called extra-parliamentary left. They spent their summer in Yugoslavia together with their friends. And then I came up, they were very young. They wanted to experience the type of system and society they wanted to see in Italy. They never seen this coming. And several of their friends joined later the Red Brigades in the mid-late 70s. And I remember visiting them in jail, generally on Sunday, after going to the church mass. That was my Italy. We are in the late 70s. It was at the time that the European project, that I never heard about, entered my life. It came unsolicited, unexpected, but it freed myself from the social immobility typical of my country and my region. It broke away the historical prejudice transmitted to me by my parents and grandparents. My grandma, who lived with us, always refused to meet my best friend from Germany when he was paying a visit. He never accepted to actually meet a German, just to tell you about the gravity and the sense of historical weight that existed in that house. But in short, the EU probably could have been something else, but it happened to be the EU. It opened up an entire new space, both geographical and mental, that has entirely redefined in a myriad of ways who I am and also the life chances I acquired as a result. And if you fast forward 25 years plus from that moment, and without even realizing, I took the European project so seriously, like many other millions of people, that I turned it not only the object of my study, but also as part of my life. So I happen to be an Italian who works in France and spend a lot of time in Belgium, in Brussels, and is growing his children in the country, in the north part of Spain. And we are over 20 million in Europe who are permanently living in a country different than the one in which we were born. We live in the interstices of the nation states. There's a lot of administrative promiscuity. Nobody really knows how many we are. And I already know what you're thinking. No, we are not all professors and academics. Actually, most European mobile citizens are blue-collar workers. We are not white-collar workers. And then, of course, we have Polish in Ireland, Italian waiters in Dublin, Romanians in Milan, and you know them, right? Then there are seasonal workers, and then there are third country migrants coming from far away, from other regions of Europe, and then we have second generations. And some of us, I've been playing with Nikola Milanese, who you know, on this label, the most European Europeans, which is not necessarily a label I like, but the reality is that we are not a self-aware community. All the people I mentioned to you, blue, white collars, seasonable workers, we share so much, but we are not a self-aware community. And at the same time, we are probably the only people who have dared to imagine Europe. Europe as an imagined community, well, we have imagined it because it's part of what we have been going through over the past few years or decades. And if we have been granted many rights, including that of not being discriminated based on nationality, that's what Europe is about, to be treated like the others when you go to another country. That's what Europe is about. We remain one of the least politically represented groups in Europe. Because, basically, in the country in which we decided to reside, we don't enjoy political rights, right? We are mobile citizens, but we pay taxes. You all know, no taxation without representation. Well, this is the case for millions of Europeans. We can vote in local and European elections, but 95% of us doesn't do that. Only 5% of European mobile citizens do show up for local or European elections. And I think the question there is, who would represent us? Should I vote for an Italian MEP candidate? Should I vote for a Spanish one where I live? How can they represent us if they've never really lived or experienced Europe on their skin? I think this is one of the questions asked. This set of questions stemming from my life experience of Europe seem to be a very first world problem, a concern of only the few, not of the many. But in reality, it hides a broader yet largely unheard story, which should be of interest to virtually all the residents of Europe, as well as the citizens of candidate countries and beyond. Why so? Because although the European Union affects all of us through its policies, every day a bit more, policies that are become hardly distinguishable from the state rule, we have little or no control on how those policies are shaped, who is actually defining them. It's the states, it's not the citizens, that call the shots in Europe. And this had not really changed over time, despite the EU acquiring increasing authority over time. But how did we end up there? Well, historically, European citizens, all of them, have been neglected in the development of European Union. They've been largely marginalized. It was the states and the court that together have been integrating Europe. And without really asking for authorization from the citizens. But the citizens are the holders of sovereignty and of the so-called constituent power. We never gave delegation to our governments to actually do what we're doing. In other words, in Europe, there's no distinction between the constituent power and the constituted power. The constituted power are the institutions. They decide by themselves. They give themselves authority and they decide for us. And we are spectators of all that process. For decades, the EU was not even aware. They didn't even try to fix this democratic unease. The word democracy was not even mentioned in treaties since the 2000s. And basically, the European Union decided deliberately to sacrifice democracy on the altar of integration. The EU has for decades derived its democratic legitimacy from the so-called permissive consensus. If the members of the Union are democracy, then the EU must be a democracy. This story is no longer tenable. We see a growing number of citizens asking themselves how this system works, because this system is affecting our lives, and they are reclaiming a say. They're trying to get a sense of what's going on. So what is the state of democracy in Europe, if we have to simplify and be very frank about it? Let's move to next week. Next Thursdays, the Dutch are going to vote for the European elections. Then the Maltese and the Irish on Friday, and then Saturday and Sunday. In other words, European voters are going to vote for the European elections on different dates. They're going to be voting for national parties, they're going to be voting for national programs, and they're going to be voting for national candidates. There's nothing European in the European elections. European elections are a sum of 27 parallel electoral processes. And this is something we have entirely normalized. No national party, and I can give you a lot of examples, has the obligation to tell its voters which is its European allegiance. The Five-Star Movement in Italy has been in government, it's been around for almost 20 years, still has to tell us whether they are pro, anti, centric, right, left. They don't have a European allegiance. Because when we see the ballot box, we only see the logos of the national parties. So how many French voting for Les Républicains, they know they're going to be voting for Forza Italia or for CDU or New Democratia. How many people voting for PIS knows or aware they're also going to be voting for Vox and for Giorgia Meloni? How many people in the Netherlands know that voting VVD or voting D66 is exactly the same, even though the last government of Mr. Rutte fell because these two parties could not get along well? But then in Europe, same political party, nothing has changed. All this is hidden, is not visible. So the EU has not a European political party system. The EU has not a pan-European electoral competition. All of this is hidden from us. Why? Because there's another historical issue, that the EU has no European media sphere. Everything that happens in Europe, it could be Mr. Scholz giving a speech to the European Parliament, is going to be narrated in 27 different ways. Why? Because the media is going to be interpreted that language through the prism of the national debate. So over the years, I've been challenging many political scientists who have been overstating, in my view, that the EU suffers from a democratic deficit. Virtually everybody, directly or indirectly, is democratically legitimated in Europe. But what is not clear is how these preferences that we are periodically called upon to express do make sense in Europe. So Europe would probably suffer more from an intelligibility deficit than from a democratic one. And my claim is that this lack of intelligibility of the political system and the lack of a European political space is what is holding us back as a continent that is trying to integrate. This is what has been labeled already 20 years ago, democracy without politics. I guess there is more politics today. There's more politicization than ever, but there's no democratization that has been following in the way in which that European politics is growing. And the big question in the European scenario is who is accountable for those decisions? Decisions that are affecting our life, from inflation all the way to the decision to make decarbonization as the new raison d'etre of Europe, and then seeing the outgoing president of the European Commission, the champion of that policy agenda, turning her back to that policy only 5 months before the European elections. Who is accountable? How is it possible to potentially hold her accountable for that? Actually, she's the front runner to become the next president of the European Commission. Who is accountable for accepting a system that has basically turned a blind eye to systematic breaches of the rule of law by accepting that the very same principle that countries have been signing up to when joining the European Union could be trade-off towards, for instance, the lift veto on the support of Ukraine. Who is accountable for a premature decision such as the one the Commission took only a few days ago without much evidence to basically say, go ahead, Poland is free from the Article 7, but the reforms are simply not there. So this is delegitimizing the ability of the next European Commission to hold accountable any other member states departing from those rules. Europeans, as citizens, cannot really hold the European Commission accountable. And this is the major difference between a nation state and the European Union. And this original sin is becoming more and more visible. On paper, we can, the Parliament could, a sort of impeachment process, but we never even tried. And this is certainly something that cannot happen. There's a conflict of interest. Why the same majority that has been supporting Ursula von der Leyen should actually now start that kind of process? It's simply not going to happen. But if politics is not there, is not Europeanizing, society it is. The Europeanization has been running very fast in the past 20 decades. All indicators suggest that this is really happening. So if I ask you how many European citizens do live in another European country, I gave you the number, but in percentage point, how much it is, 4%. When I ask my students, they all say 20%. They have this misperception, right? Because we live in very segmented society. They are surrounded by people who travel, who move around, the mobile and the immobile. But there's another data that I think is much more interesting, which is the following. How many Europeans are exposed to Europe at least once a year because they cross the border, because they go on holiday, because they have family. So they don't cross the border, but they just have family there. Or they simply have exposure to another country. This number is 50%, which I think is a significant number if you consider that we have been together for a few decades. But of course, this also hides the other number, which is the other 50%, which is not necessarily exposed to the European Union. And we all know that the EU has been putting a premium on the mobile versus the immobile. And this is another original sin. It is against this realization, the gap is existing between the unprecedented socioeconomic integration of Europe and the lack of a political space that in the past 20 years there have been attempts to Europeanize politics, trying to come up with an idea that is into the books since 2009 that says that basically the EU has to work like a parliamentary majority. And that's why there's so much speculation on how these different groups are going to be supporting or not supporting the different candidates that the European Council could put forward. And the idea is very much captured, as you know, in this language, taking into account the election of the European Parliament. And the way in which it was interpreted the first time, in 2014, the first time that the Lisbon Treaty actually produced effect, was to say, as you know, each European political party has to select a candidate who will become the face of that party agenda, so as to Europeanize that agenda beyond the 27 national elections. So for the first time, a link was created, at least ideally, between you casting the ballot box and the political color of the next commission. It actually worked in the sense that Mr. Juncker, who was the leader of the party who got most of the vote, automatically became president of the European Commission. But then, if you fast forward to 2019, it didn't work the same way. Why? Because the automaticity of the Spitzenkandidaten meant that no other party had a chance to actually become the president of the European Commission. So it was very interesting to see how not only the anti-European, or at least those contesting it, like Fidesz at the time, but also Renew of Macron said, no, we are not going to put forward a candidate because we will never become number one. So they start damaging the process in the run-up to the elections, and then you all know how it ended up. There was no automaticity. That means that Timmermans became number two, the second option. It didn't last more than probably 2 days. And then they moved to the Liberals to see if any of them could. But then, of course, there was this cherry picking. So this process was basically up in the air. And the big question at the time was, how can we fix that? Why European citizens should vote in 2024 if this link that we try to create between their political choice of voting and the political colors is no longer secure. And I think that's where we are today. But today we don't have a clear agreement between European political parties and the head of state and government on what kind of rules should we follow. Spitzenkandidaten, yes or no, automatic, non-automatic, or it has any relevance at all. She was aware of it. The first statement she made when she walked out of the European Parliament, when she made it for 8 votes of difference between those supporting her and those not supporting her, was, I'm going to introduce 2 major reforms. You probably forgot about this. We all forgot about this. We tend to forget these kind of big reform promises that are made in that moment. But the first promise was, we're going to be listening to European citizens, and we're going to do these 2 things. We're going to change representative democracy, new electoral law, and we're going to change participatory democracy, Conference on the Future of Europe. We all know how it goes, but this was an important proposal. The proposal, if approved by the European Council, it was approved by the Parliament by 400 MEPs, so almost 2/3 of the Parliament. They would have created, for all European voters, 2 rights. So next week, we would have expressed 2 preferences. One preference for our candidate, national or local candidate, depending on the electoral law in that state, but then we would express another preference for a candidate running on a pan-European college. This would have obliged every single national party, including the 5-Star Movement, to tell us which is their European political party affiliation so as to make it intelligible, the actual vote we would have made. This would have been a game changer, and this is probably the reason why the head of state and government, they never wanted to discuss this proposal, despite the Parliament pushing and asking for it. So it didn't really happen. When it comes to the second proposal, we already alluded to it yesterday. Major transnational experiment, nobody really heard about this in Europe. 800 people randomly selected, meeting 3 times and coming up with a lot of proposals, a lot of ideas, and some of them are quite interesting, but all suggesting not necessarily that they want more Europe, but that they certainly want to understand more about Europe. There's clearly a hunger, a thirst to understand how decision-making occurs in Europe because there's a realization that this is affecting them. So now, in the absence of a clear-cut set of rules, we see this Spitzen charade. Each European party putting forward candidates, none of whom has an actual chance or certainty to become the next president of the European Commission. So in a way, it's a bit of a circus. And here we have fun analyzing the transparency or the lack of transparency in selecting the candidates, primaries or not primaries, and the process used to write down a European political manifesto. So there are difficult traffic lights. As you can see, you have the green, the lights, and the oranges, the amber. But none of them has a certainty, certainly not the front runner, the official front runner. But democracy is much more than voting, and this is where my hopes lie when thinking about making the EU a people's project. Since 2009, the EU realized that representative democracy was not necessarily the only source of legitimacy. It was important to also create channels of participation, allowing citizens in the space in between elections to potentially help the EU to set the agenda. In other words, the deal was, since Europe is not really democratic, there are shortcomings which are structural in nature. We're going to try to compensate those by creating many more opportunities to shape the policy process in between elections. And if you look at the participatory toolbox, and I've been devoting more than 10 years of my life studying these tools, which are very little used, as you will see, shows that, in average, the EU is much more open than the average member states. It creates, on paper, many more opportunities than any other country in the European Union. You have petitions to the European Parliament, public consultations which are mandatory on any new initiative. You have complaints to the Ombudsman, you have requests for access to documents like Freedom of Information Act. You have so many tools. And very important, when you look at the history of constitutionalism, you think about the US, those are open to also disenfranchised individuals. You don't have to be a European citizen to file a petition to the European Parliament. You can be a migrant who just arrived in Lampedusa, and you can file a petition to the European Parliament. So the question is, why are we not using it? Well, a lot of structural reasons, but those avenues are little known, and they are very underused. And my working hypothesis, which is partly backed up by some archive work, is that there has been a deliberate attempt by European leaders turn these tools into accessible
channels of participation that could have made any difference in terms of agenda setting. They have rather been boycotting their uptake. And this is reproduced at different levels of time, in the same way as the European electoral law doesn't want to be developed. Very quickly, this is the number of petitions to the European Parliament since the early days, in the 50s, European Call and Steel Community, all the way to last year. As you can see, we have an average of 2,000 people taking the time to file a petition to the European Parliament and asking for help. If you compare this number with Germany, in Germany you have 13,000 people out of 90 million, not out of 450 million, using these tools. So it's, I think, a useful comparison to put things in perspective. Complaints to the Ombudsman when something goes wrong in the relationship between the EU and the citizens, well, less than 1,000. What about complaints to the European Commission? 4,000. What about European citizen initiatives, allowing 7 citizens to come together and ask the EU to do something? In 2012, I registered the first European citizen initiative on international roaming. We never collected 1 million signatures, but we clearly set the agenda that then was picked up by the political entrepreneur of the time. But you see, it's a very low number, in average less than 100 since 2012. So in 10 years, 450 million were only able to lodge, to actually file 100 requests over time. Access to documents also very plateauing. Public consultations, very different uptake. So who are the people who take the time to respond to the European Commission? Besides the fact they're the usual suspects, so organized interest, you also have citizens. And you see here, the lighter the color, the higher the number of participation, with Germany and Austria taking this public consultation more seriously than other countries. So in average, when you aggregate all these numbers, you have approximately 200,000 people engaging on a regular basis with the European institution, which is, of course, very, very low. It's an extremely low number, but still an interesting one, because we don't know much about the demographics. Who are those people? They are people who belong to which socioeconomics? We don't know. And if you ask the institutions, they don't care much, but they should probably, because this is a core community that is engaging with them. But we don't really know. So I think the EU can do better, much better, both on electoral processes and in participatory processes if it cares about democracy. But European leaders, as I anticipated, have been historically reluctant to take care of the expression of popular will. And here we have different hypotheses, and I'm quite sympathetic with the idea that was developed by Jan Werner Müller, who basically said, you know, the EU has been set up to counter the expression of popular will. It is this popular will that can shape and take control. The EU was set up to avoid this, to counter it. How can all of a sudden be shaped by the expression of popular will? We should rather insulate decision-making from this expression that comes from the bottom up. And I think there's something into it when trying to understand why there is this atavistic reflex basically limiting the ability of the people to have a say in European integration. But of course, and I'm coming to an end, the European neglect for citizens in developing is a very dangerous game. If you think about the acceleration we have been witnessing when it comes to the Next Generation EU, when it comes to the European PACE facility, all those activities, all those policies have been taken up based on Article 122 of the treaty, which is not very sexy, but basically that means that no democratic scrutiny, no parliament, no European Parliament involvement. So we see the major policies affecting the direction of Europe, not entailing the participation of the European Parliament whatsoever. And we have kind of normalized it, we have kind of accepted that this is clearly the case. As power wielded by the European institution is increasing, some forms of power sharing is needed. A different way of taking decisions is needed. We can no longer accept that the best or the most delicate decisions are taken at 4 a.m. at night during the next European Council. I think this is simply not acceptable, but we have normalized it. It has become the bread and butter of what the European Union is, and there are people who actually legitimize those choices. So my interesting counterfactual question to that is, what if European citizens who have been taking seriously Europe, residents of Europe, wannabe residents of Europe, will take more seriously these possibilities, how Europe would look like if instead of having 80, 90 European citizen initiatives, we had 2,000 or 500,000. How the European institutional machinery and European leaders would have reacted to that. How this desire for agenda setting would have been translated into the European decision-making. It might sound utopian or perhaps dystopian, depending on where you stand, but I think it's a legitimate question to be asked. Because according to the original plans of the so-called founding fathers in the 50s, that's exactly what should have happened, right? These instruments were there, and they were foreseen there. And here, perhaps, a couple of opportunities which have been suspended, and I speak to a very expert audience here. This idea that the widening and the deepening of Europe, they're going to come together in one way or another, might offer an opportunity to rethink entirely the citizens' role in the European operation. It could be a game changer if the EU realizes that it has deprived itself from receiving citizens' input during the membership process, during the candidate process, which have potentially helped the European Union to have legitimacy when going after Mr. Orban. If the Hungarian, at some point, the Hungarians had the chance at the time of accession to actually vote for that integration process. How different that would have been if some democratic legitimacy to that decision would have been ensured. So here, thinking how we can consider this an opportunity to not only reconsider what accession means, but also what membership means. If the level of commitment that some current member states is no longer the same that existed in 2005, this should be considered, or in 1957, this should be considered. In other words, why don't we use this as an opportunity to potentially inject a new dynamic that might help it? Last slide, I promise. Some ideas that sound slightly weird, perhaps idealistic, but very basic. Why don't we drastically simplify, embrace plain speaking when thinking about the EU? Why do we have to have so many institutions called council, right? Why don't we start from there? Why don't we radically Europeanize the electoral process along the lines I described to you? Why don't we democratize access to European decision-making by experimenting also with citizens' assemblies around the ideas that Eva presented yesterday, by having a permanent structure of selected citizens defining exactly how the constituent power is giving the institutions delegation to adopt those decisions. I think there's a bit of a chill effect on our ability to imagine Europe, and that's, I think, what we have to counter, our complacency or our dissatisfaction that is kind of getting us stuck in thinking, reimagining another Europe that, you know, might perhaps deserve a different kind of account, because there are people, again, who will be taking seriously this project as still something that is different, it has some value, and which I think deserves to be given another chance. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alberto. I'm especially impressed by the way that you actually went to the trouble to research how and how many Europeans actually engage with all of these potential avenues of participation. I was aware of all of them. I've used some of them myself, but I never actually saw statistics on how many people. So this is already enlightening us greatly. Thank you very much. So I am not going to do the thing that everybody does these days, which is the chair drones on for 10 minutes after and asks the first 3 questions. I'm going to do the old-fashioned thing, which is the chair reserves her opinions and hands over to the respondents, and then I might add a few questions later on, depending on how awake the rest of you are. So start preparing your questions, because I'll be coming to you shortly. Rosa, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Alberto. It's always great to watch you present, because it's like a show, and it's also super interesting. Let me start. I'm going to start with a couple of anecdotes as well, and the first is a personal one. So my great-grandfather was the official painter for the British Army. Some of you have heard this already, sorry. For the British Army during the First World War. and he was French. And I like telling this story because if you talk to EU defense people, I say, well, my family was doing pooling and sharing in the First World War before they even invented the term. Because that, that's one of the areas that has, most nationalist, one of the EU areas that is most governed by nationalism. The second example, I'd like to, and of course, I mean, that's, some, a bit of Italian, a bit of French, a bit of British, a bit of this and that, living in Brussels. But again, another personal anecdote, it must have been about 15 years ago that I was on a boat on my way to Halki or Poros, or one of those beautiful Greek islands where Lucas Tsoukalis holds his Europe retreats. Idra, yeah, well, it wasn't Idra actually, it was another island, but it doesn't matter. And I was there with a Dutch person working around politics, and he accused me of being a citizen of nowhere. And this was, this was before there was talk about the citizen of nowhere. And I was like, I really don't see myself. My great-grandfather was painting for the British Army. It was a very mundane job. It wasn't, And so I had this sort of moment of realization of how me and that teeny-weeny elite, 44% of that you had, is seen by others. And then a few weeks, maybe a few months ago, there was an article in the FT by Janan Ganesh, who went to, Asia on holiday, and he said, go to Asia and just see how diverse Asia is. And to be honest, Europe looks pretty uniform. And he was just talking about how Europe is plagued by the narcissism of small difference. And I think those of us who are working on EU politics and foreign policy know exactly what he was talking about. So, Alberto, what you're saying resonates a lot, both at the personal level and at the analytical level. But I am wondering about your use of imagined communities, etc., because I do have some problems with the debates that we are seeing and the narratives that are being developed, which are geared towards building up European solidarity around civilizational ideas. And the Imagined Communities framework is a wonderful framework for interpreting and understanding national self-determination movements and for understanding the history of nationalism. But I've always been a firm believer that the EU should not replicate that model in practice. Hence, I've never been a federalist. But also, I think there are huge pitfalls in civilizational interpretations of European integration. However, all the work that you're doing is very much focused on tools, on participation, and on civic identities and civic values that can hold us together. And that's why I think it's super relevant and very interesting. So let me move on now a little bit to the substance of what you were saying. And I think you've put your finger on something really important. And that is, you talked about the permissive consensus, and that is really the relationship between technocratic governance and democratic governance. And I think this is the sort of fil rouge that runs throughout European integration from the very beginning. It has been a technocratic project. I think it reached its peak in the 1990s with the Treaty on the European Union. And then further integration was, citizens did not want it, right? So, 2005, citizens vote in France and the Netherlands voted again against the treaty on the constitutional treaty. And that was the end of that type of experiment. And I would say even the federalists in the EU political context are weakened at the moment. Nobody's really is positing that as a goal. And we are missing alternative models of how to hang together. So I think you have a lot of great ideas about that. And I think what's interesting is that you're trying to bypass all the various levels. You're trying to create direct connections between citizens and the EU level. And I think the tools, and I agree, that the tools are all, I think you have a lot of good ideas. But I do wonder, and this is not against what you're doing, it's just an addition to, where are the sources of the problems? And when I was fellow, I was what I was arguing was that a lot of the source of the so-called democratic deficit, and I agree with you on that that's not necessarily the problem, but a lot of those sources are actually at the national level. That it's not just Poland and Hungary that have seen great regression on democratic standards, but we're also seeing a qualitative regression in all EU member states. We're seeing them in advanced democracies, and if you look at all the statistics, VDEM, Economist Intelligence Unit, Democracy Index, all the data is suggesting this. And actually, Europe is the region that has declined the most in terms of democratic standards since 2006. So the fall has been the greatest in Europe. But this has a lot to do. There are all sorts of reasons behind this. The crisis of the media model. There are frequent encroachments on civil society, on freedom, etc., etc. So I think there is a need to just focus on that level and just have perhaps a more holistic approach to why is it that the EU is not functioning. And where we do see a bit of a crisis is in this, the backlash against technocracy is nationalism. The backlash against technocracy is all the things that we've been talking about, the rise of the far right. It is taking a shape that is anti-European and that is, trying to put the nation state at the heart of political action. So in my view, from the point of view of democracy, against a backdrop in which global politics and international relations are moving in complicated, conflictual, contradictory directions. You have the return of great power rivalry, but you also have the force of transnational trends, such as the climate crisis, such as technology. And then you have a return of, or a salience of local politics. You have a demand for greater say, I think also at local political level, and you have the EU. So how to think about this? And I really think there's and I forget the name of who's put this forward, this multiplex international system. And I think it works quite well. Luke, do you know who am I talking about? No. Okay. Multiplex. Oh, I'll look it up. It's in my notes somewhere. Yeah. You have that, and I think for Europe, being quite an advanced experiment of regional integration and of democracy, adapting a little bit the sort of multiplex approach to international relations, thinking about multi-level democracy, whereby you would have the local, which I think really, we haven't talked about it much, but I think it is a dimension of politics in which citizens can feel they can participate. There's a lot of neighborhood initiatives. There's quite a lot of activity on that front. I think a lot of these people don't go to vote. Perhaps many of them are those who don't vote, but they are active in their local communities. National level, EU level, and international level. And then, then having a direct connection between the citizens and the EU level is helpful. But perhaps it's not the only way to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosa. So,
I think you're the only actually elected politician in this room. So
Former. Yes.
So people have actually voted for you, unlike the rest of us.
So I really enjoyed the presentation, and it was an eye-opener in some ways, in particular with some of the facts and numbers present, and the whole perspective in many ways. So talking about those 20 million, I was sort of part of the expat community of the Netherlands. The Hague is a city of international justice, ICC, which is in the news for obvious reasons these days, but also the International Court of Justice, the OPCW, and all this. This attracts a number of non-Dutch that are there for many years. And when I left the embassy and started with a job in a Dutch think tank started by Madeleine Albright and Josias van Aertsen, I was definitely part of this community in many ways. As a taxpayer and a legal resident, I was a knowledge migrant in the Netherlands. I could have voted at local elections, but not really at national elections. So then trying to sort of legitimize my participation in this panel, I also come from a country that was once known People's Republic of Macedonia before becoming a socialist Republic of Macedonia. This is sort of a sleep I often have because of the name business that we have been facing. And at home, by think tank, one of the bigger projects that we have is essentially, it's called Imagine. It's a platform for civic engagement where we base our actions upon the presumption that politics is too important to be left to political parties only, and that the responsibility and the rights of the citizens do not end with elections, that we can do things in between elections. So at the moment we have a campaign to change, to introduce some meritocracy in the healthcare system in the country. So as I was driving to Cres, I listened to the Croatian radio. Around Zagreb there was a big traffic jam, and news was there, listening to both the Social Democrats and HDZ candidates for members of the European Parliament. The issues were local. And at the end, there was an attempt to sort of connect them to the EU and European politics and the role of what a member of a European Parliament can do. But it was definitely local. So I definitely see a dissonance between what they do in Brussels and what they campaign upon nationally. Another idea that comes to mind, and with Alberto we've discussed it briefly before this session, most of the big challenges of Europe today can hardly be tackled nationally, even by the biggest member states of the Union. So security comes to mind, right? Or migration, or climate change. So in a way, the solutions to these challenges are obviously at least European, some of them even leaning towards global, but those decisions are done, and the promises and the debates are done nationally. So there is this disconnect in many ways between what we need to do and what the challenges are, and how we talk about them and who makes those decisions. Because even the most powerful leader of Germany cannot really promise that these challenges will be tackled. It's beyond Germany's power in many ways, even though it's one of the biggest and most powerful member states together with France. Then I did a bit of reading for this session, and today there is a debate in the Flemish public broadcaster in Belgium, where one of the very few pan-European, or let's say a political grouping with an ambition to become a pan-European, Volt, was not granted, was not invited to take part in the debate. So they appealed, they brought the case before a court, and the court decided that this was not necessary. So they're not taking part in this debate in the Flemish broadcaster. This is Sophie van der Veld, who is already a member of the European Parliament, who many of us know, etc., etc. So I think on, let's say, on the first part, I completely endorse Rosa in fully endorsing all of these ideas that there is a toolbox, and what will happen if this toolbox is more used. I think this will create a dynamic that will be helpful for Europe, for the continent, for the institutions in Brussels. But I think the debate on the proposal to introduce a European constituency, and this resolution in the European Parliament that was adopted in 2022, essentially initially talked about 28 seats. So in a parliament of 700 plus, we are talking about 28 parliamentarians who will be representing Europe. And I think it's worth further discussing this, reminding at the time the heads of states and governments, that is the council, said we will revert to the issue before the 2024 elections, but I haven't seen much of reverting done. So I'll stop with this. For me, this has been a fascinating distraction from a usual topic, which is enlargement. And I will use this role to maybe ask Alberto, because one of the conclusions was rethinking accession. Maybe if you can elaborate a bit more on that, because I would like to rethink accession. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nikola. Okay, so first of all, Stefan, do we have a microphone coming that way, or should we? Yeah, thank you. No, Stefan first. Yeah, and then we'll go back.
Alberto, I very much enjoyed your presentation. It was a wonderful show. Basically, I am 100% with you when it comes to transnational lists. I think it's a great tragedy that this didn't come about, that we have these 27 parallel national elections where, for instance, Mrs. Meloni put herself on the top of the list, even though she has zero interest either being a Spitzenkandidat nor to be part of the European Parliament. She consciously turns it into some kind of popularity test for her government. I think that's an aberration that's really perverted. And I'm really struck by this contradiction that the member states were extremely generous in giving the European Parliament big powers, budgetary, legislative, control powers, etc., but are so reluctant in opening up the political space and turning this into European elections. I think 28 wouldn't be many, but it would be a first step, and it would really make a difference. I'm much more skeptical than you when it comes to deliberative democracy. Not that it's not a good thing, it's a very good thing. I think it works best on the local level. It works to some extent on the national level. I think the Conference on the Future of Europe really has shown how difficult it is to do this in a meaningful way on the European level. It was the pandemic, but that was not the only problem. The time slots were too narrow, the topics much too wide. But I think even if you have 800 Europeans thinking and debating something, does that give really more legitimacy? Because 800 is not that many. And the second problem, big problem that you have is to connect deliberative democracy to representative democracy. I remember a conversation with a Greek member of the European Parliament who said, well, I've been elected by the people of Saloniki. Why should I take someone seriously who has been elected by an algorithm and chosen by random, basically? I think you have the fundamental problem how to connect deliberative with the democratic. My last point is, I think the problem of democracy in Europe is primarily a problem on the national level. I think if we have still negative trends in many countries and rise of illiberal thinking, this is primarily a national problem. We have fewer participation in elections, we fewer memberships in parties, we have less trust in politicians. We sort of on all accounts, we're going basically downhill. And I think the remedy to this deficit also has primarily to be found on the national level.
Hi, just to present myself, I'm Gazela from University of Belgrade. I'm not really part of Eurofutures alumni, but thank you for the opportunity to listen to this, and it's really interesting to think about actually the title which you have for the moment on the screen. I wanted to ask something which is, in a way, we had experiment, I would call it experiment, with trying to build European political option, let's say like that, which goes beyond these family parties, and that was DiEM25. And I mean, there are many, many reasons why that was not successful experiment, but still it was experiment on the European level. And we saw from the, when we observe family parties, we actually see that some of them are very well coordinated and connected on the international level, on the European level, like EPP, for example. I was listening to people who were claiming that EPP is going and making a circus around their annual events, and everybody follows them, and contrary to that, social democrats, nobody knows when they have a European convention, for example. So there is understanding from one side, which is actually the side which we wouldn't support, which is going towards more national, that is very well coordinating, and those who maybe would go to more European, that they fail somehow in presenting themselves. And I think this presenting themselves is very important, especially when I come from Serbia, where presenting this narrative is something which is crucial in capturing the people and attention and elections in a way. They are doing the same on the national level and replicating that on European level. So how we can fight this if we have very strong coordinated actions from those who want to keep everything on the national level, and on the other side we have those who maybe would go for European, who are not maybe addressing at all on the public level and not addressing right questions on the European level. Because, for example, I miss here the discussion about crucial topics of economy, which I think for people are most important, much more important than having my vote for something, having my life depending on which income. And that is maybe the discussion which might be brought further.
Yeah, just one crazy idea. Are we in the status that we believe everything what is local is European and everything what is European is local? If I observe our elections now in Austria, everything what I see is discussed there is partly local, partly not. But everything what is not local is also local, because it's about Green Deal, or everything what is local is about Europe. I don't see a difference there anymore. There is no difference between local politics and European politics. If this is the case, why don't we, this is crazy, so why don't we combine national and European elections? To say, no, why not? I elect, for example, now in Austria, we elect the national parliament, and I can say, okay, I elect the leading party, but the leading party also nominates the 5 or 6 people which are then sent to Brussels. And everybody does it. All of a sudden, there's a completely different relevance there, because it's not the difference. Europe, you elect somebody for the European Parliament and then he's gone or she's gone. Every 5 years, 4 years, I don't know. I forgot that. 6 years? I don't know how to, when is European Parliament? 5? Yeah, so after 5 years, the guy or the girl who I elected 5 years ago suddenly appears again and says, oh yeah, I remember. That was a really long time ago. Because there's no publicity for those people coming from the European into a national discourse. Who is that guy? So, you know, I was elected as the leading. That doesn't work. And I have the feeling it will never work. I don't know how we can make it. But if, therefore I said, if we say everything is European, what is local, and everything what is local, migration, for example, biggest topic in the election, biggest. It's European, it's local. So if we do this combination thing, everything is European, was local, and local is European, I would do this together. No European elections. There's one election, and it's European, and it's Austrian, full stop.
Felix, could you come to the front to Katie? I should just... was created in 1979. That was the system. It was national parliamentarians who met periodically in Brussels under an organization or a body called COSAC. Well, we can debate that, but I mean, it's important to remember the history, and there are ideas about forming a second chamber, a kind of Senate, but through that means. But I'm sure Alberto has some ideas on this. Katie.
Thank you very much, Alberto. I really enjoyed that. I'm really enjoying this panel. My question is, what is the purpose of having a voice? And so I think we need to disaggregate between the various inputs that you put in. So Ombudsman is different to FOI, different to consultation. And to zone in on the public consultation point, when does it happen and how, what impact does it have? And the reason I'm particularly interested in this, obviously in relation to what we no longer have. And so in Northern Ireland, we're still obviously by EU law, we're dynamically aligned to the single market rules for goods, but we have no voice, so to speak. What the EU has said to us is, well, you can have your say, you can use that have your say thing on the EU website. But interestingly, people are more alert now as to the limitations of that and the sense of, well, how does that actually affect the laws that are being made that will directly impact on us? And so I think that is important to be able to differentiate between what's relation to governance and the laws that apply, and then other aspects of voice, if you see what I mean.
Well, as we were discussing at lunch, Northern Ireland is also disenfranchised from Westminster as well, so it's just the norm there. My question is on I also love the presentation, and my question is, are you too focused on the formal over the substantive? You've probably been asked this before, but I think the last European elections was when we had our fellowship, right? Is it 5 years ago? And so, I was spending a lot of time in Austria at the time, and we did go to the EUI, like Spitzencandidate debate and things like that. But, my overriding impression, and being a Brit in Austria, this is a very European election. I mean, it seemed like incredibly European. It was discussing European issues all the time, that MEPs were jumping between countries all over the place in the news, the future of Europe, etc. So I guess my tertiary question is also, was the last European election more European than this one? Because I've got no idea what this one's like, for obvious reasons.
Thank you so much for these great presentations and a lot of ideas. I have one more to add, which we already discussed, but which we already discussed last year here, and that was that group of Europe Future Fellows produces something ahead of this year's EU elections. So we have EU elections in a week, and we have tomorrow afternoon off. So Alberto inspired me to say out loud the idea which we discussed the other night at the dinner. I think it would be good, if you agree with me, to produce, I don't know, a letter from Cres ahead of EU elections, something short, some not substantial paper, but something romantically to the public, and we can share it on our website. Just a thought. Thank you.
Yeah, just one thought about the prerequisites of Europeanization, of what Alberto called Europeanization. For instance, if discussing and deciding on a little thing like to summertime or not, and all of a sudden it turns out that 95% of those who want to block this decision for whatever stupid or so stupid reason are Germans and Austrians, why to hell should 95% of citizens in other European countries feel even concerned about this? You know, so what degree of homogenization, of evenness of political participation, of Europeanization of awareness, for instance, of the salience of the issue? Is anybody in this or that country interested at all to discuss it, even to think about it? Or is it a hot issue? So obviously there are preconditions of Europeanize issues when it comes to decision making. If you before haven't gone through a mental kind of whatever harmonization, convergence, upward convergence, higher interest, higher salience of these issues. Otherwise, it would, and then it comes to more serious issues such as summertime or wintertime. For instance, the harmonization of the railway system. You know, this is a disaster up to this very day. I do not have to elaborate on that. But tangible issues and important and truly hot issues, we will not be able, if it's not of a concern, of similar concern in the different member states. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Alberto. It was really a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. Most of the elements in the presentation, you focus on the EU itself, on the European Union. But you finish with this slide, which I guess the background is in Zurich, and you said that the Europe, not the EU, we need to imagine. So, based on this, do you see any kind of a role? Well, okay, Switzerland has a different kind of status, but do you see any role of the candidate or citizens from candidate countries, or future citizens of EU, in this exercise? Because as Western Balkan countries, we have been part of the Conference on the Future of Europe. We have organized events. We have given proposals. So do you see any kind of more substantial role of the citizens of at least the countries which are now candidates for EU membership? Thank you.
Just shortly, because I want to reflect on what Ivana was suggesting, and I want to remind you that 2 years ago it was exactly on Cres where the EU Enlargement Advocacy Initiative was kicked off, and it had great resonance, and it's still ongoing. So what Ivana suggested is basically, you know, what is in the essence of what we are going to discuss tomorrow at the Europe's Futures alumni meeting, and that is how to create a platform and how to encourage actions beyond the actual fellowship program with the community of fellows. So I think that would be a great demonstration. Just a week before the European elections, we are here. We can publish a statement or whatever, a call for action, for going out to vote, whatever. And I think, you know, it's what Ivana meant was probably not to sacrifice the entire afternoon, even though after this I believe that for Europe we should sacrifice something. So maybe after lunch we could meet for an hour or something and come up really with a message, what could be then formulated on Cres and sent out to Europe.
So I'm going to come back to Alberto in just a moment to pick and choose what issues he would like to cover, just like a good MEP. And I just wanted to add one further thought to the rich potpourri of many things we've been thinking about this afternoon, which is on the transnational lists idea, which I think it definitely it's always disappointing when a good idea actually comes up at EU level and then it doesn't get followed up with. And initially, remember, Macron was in favour of this too, until he discovered that it might not bring him more votes. But when I was at Open Society, we were trying to push this idea of transnational lists for not the 4% of Europeans who live in another country by choice, but by the people who don't feel necessarily at home in the country of their birth because of their ethnicity. So I'm thinking of the Roma in particular. So there are, it depends on how you count it, but there are many millions of Roma, and there have been a few Roma MEPs. I think there have been about 3 total people in the European Parliament from Hungary and from Finland. I think there was one from Slovakia at one point as well. But the Roma as a whole, they're between maybe 10 and 12 million Roma, don't have a representative. And so we innocently, as Open Society, said these are the people who don't vote at home, they don't have identity papers, it's very difficult for them. You know, this is a way of bringing an unrepresented democracy, minority to democratic representation. And what was fascinating was the organizations that really pushed back on this idea were the Muslims, who were like, wait a minute, we have representation in France or in Germany, in the Bundestag, in the Assemblée Nationale. Don't start telling us that there's going to be a pan-European Muslim vote. That's really unhelpful. We want to maintain our rights and so on in the legal systems as well as the political systems where we are. And also, for example, gay rights groups who were also saying, don't create a cohort of gay MEPs. This is not helpful to us. We want to go mainstream. So it's a very interesting point. And I think the Roma being so marginalized that there's really so few opportunities for participation, that's why transnational lists are a really an interesting idea. But for those who feel like, okay, we have representation at national level, it's not. It tells you that's a kind of a bit of a litmus test for whether you feel fully represented or not. It'd be interesting to know what other groups think about that. But that's just a little anecdote on that particular idea. So many great points have been made. I suggest that Alberto and indeed Nikola and Rosa pick up on what interests them most and add some things, because this is a very interesting and complex issue, and I'm looking forward to Alberto's paper on the subject, and already we've given him about 4 different ideas for the title.
Lovely. Thank you so much. I feel a bit overwhelmed. Important to perhaps unpack a bit further a couple of ideas that I was not able to fully develop at the end of the presentation when I said that the matter of democratization could actually offer an opportunity for Europe to rethink both membership and accession. What did I mean by that? I meant that there are voices. I know that Ivan has been writing a piece that is touching upon this issue, suggesting that in the future we should consider about adding the participatory dimension to the accession road, in the sense of requiring and asking that the citizens of the candidate countries will at some point express their preferences in relation to the package that is agreed. And I think this is a very, to me, self-evident idea that this should have been the case since day one, but it has never been taken very seriously. Should we ever go there, should we ever include this as an additional requirement for EU accession, then the EU should apply to its own members, right? Because it would not be consistent to actually require candidate countries to have a referendum, to have citizens' assemblies, to capture the sentiment, the pulse of the population on whether or not to join the European Union and which European Union, because the whole discourse now is about multi-centric Europe, so what kind of commitment you're going to take, it's going to be the single market, it's going to be, but this applies also to the current members. So what about current members who have been
cherry picking or trying to cherry picking because de facto they exit the EU. I'm talking about Poland, legally speaking, has been out of the legal order for a few years. Wasn't perhaps correct at the time to ask the citizens of Poland what they thought about this. And this reflects of going back to the people in order to get a sense of what kind of commitment they want to take vis-a-vis the European Union could be very refreshing, but of course also very dangerous or perceived as such. You think about Brexit, you think about these binary solutions. And that's where I'm slightly more hopeful that deliberative democracy can help us to go beyond this dichotomy of asking people yes or no, idea of referenda, preferenda, so what are the different options you might want to go for, could be areas of experimentation. So this is in essence where I think more work should be done, could be done also in terms of advocacy for putting forward ideas on how this participatory framework could actually work and develop. Second part of my answer will be devoted to the Europeanization idea. So I think we all agree that there is a gap between the socioeconomic integration reached in Europe and the lack of a political space that is kind of catching up. So how do we get there if we want to get there? Since the 90s, end of the 90s, I've been thinking that transnationalist pan-European college is a great idea. Again, it can be a game changer because it would force a lot of clarity. It would avoid abuses. It would force every single national parties to say what they think and tell us what they do. However, even today, if you want to set up a European political party, what Volt tried to do, DM tried to do, the Greens partly have been trying to do, and back in the 90s we started a party called New Europeans, very few of you might have heard of it, where all stumbling upon the same obstacle, meaning that it is not legally possible to establish a European political party from scratch. You need to register the very same party with the same logo, same statute in 27 countries or more, which is exactly what at the time I've been advising to do with Volt. I was very much involved meeting the students who wanted to start this party back in 2016 and 17. They were studying in the US, and they really wanted to set up this party. And they realized that they had to basically have this blueprint. They replicated also beyond the European Union in order to have Volt started. As you correctly pointed out, I think Luke was going there, these attempts at Europeanization, even if they emerge from, let's say, very small parties with very limited claims, Volt is not very well defined in terms of political preferences, right? The major value proposition is to be the only European political party with one political agenda and one pool of candidates. But there's not much more about it, right? We would need to have 27 or 30 or more pan-European parties of that kind. But clearly now we see de-Europeanization in these elections. In other words, since those parties didn't really make it, Volt had one elected in Germany, they might make a few more in countries that have a more proportional system, like the Netherlands, a bit of Spain, perhaps in Germany, but they're not going to reach a critical mass. DM is only running, I think, in Germany and a couple of other countries with slightly different logo. So this kind of momentum is kind of lost. And this is de-Europeanizing the electoral process even further because the candidates are not even trying to run in other countries. They have no incentive whatsoever why they should be held accountable to constituencies they do not actually vote them. So it's not happening. And I think this is very disappointing that we are back in 2009, basically, in 2024. But in the meantime, Europe has been integrated enormously, and the kind of decisions will be taken by the next European Parliament will be extremely important for the future direction of the EU. Other ideas, I'm a big believer that a better synchrony between national elections in Europe could be a major difference. This is yet another idea. So it's not about one election. As it was correctly pointed out, this was the case before 1979. That meant that all the member states at the time, they had MPs, and the MPs were traveling to Strasbourg in order to attend and do the European work. It wasn't a bad model, right? Because there was this transmission belt between national politics and European politics, and the composition of the European Parliament reflected the outcome of the elections occurring in every country. So it's very similar to what Boris was describing. But the other option is synchronization, which of course is a bit scientific to imagine Mr. Macron and Scholz saying we're going to go having election at the same time, but we can imagine a commitment, a political commitment to say, let's try to make sure that in the next 3 years there won't be major elections in Europe because we want to coordinate among ourselves in order to avoid what is happening now, which is having a very different political center of gravity in the European Council and in the European Parliament. And this is what is happening now. We're going to have a European Parliament, which is going to be much more to the right than the European Council, but both of them are needed to select and elect the President of the European Commission. But they are the expression of different kind of preferences. And a couple of academic ideas were circulated about desynchronization. I remember being part of one of these roundtable in Geneva. You see, I'm very aficionado of Switzerland. Some good ideas come out of Switzerland, but then it kind of fell down. But I think we should be much more imaginative in thinking how we can reach Europeanization. Final point, a little anecdote. In 2018, the European Parliament was about to vote yet another proposal for electoral reform. It was the first time that the Parliament was actually creating transnational lists. And we mobilized with, again, Nikola Milanesi was being my partner in crime. We move European Alternatives and a few other organizations, and we collected a record high number of signatures, almost 500,000 in a matter of few weeks, to put pressure on the European Council to actually give some directions, their MEPs, in order to pass this proposal. The European Parliament voted against. Even the federalists, many federalists voted against that proposal by saying, coming up with many arguments we can discuss about, but basically saying, if you create two types of MEPs, there will be the first tier and the second tier, this is going to be damage internal cohesion, and the pan-European one, those elected on the pan-European, they're going to be even more far away from the constituency. These were the kind of arguments. We tried to debunk them, and we got a response from Rajoy government, from Macron advisors, and from Gentiloni, who was the Prime Minister of Italy. In all three countries, they really spent political capital in order to push for these ideas. And you are perfectly right that then France, which was clearly the most vocal, decided already at the time that it was not a safe bet, this transnational list. So they invited us to go to the Élysée. I remember this surreal meeting with the then Macron European political advisor, Clément Beaune, and Adam Alexandre, asking us questions. Why are you interested into this? Nobody's interested. Why civil society and NGOs care about how we elect European parliamentarians? We're like, this is essential. These are the rules of the game. We're talking about how our political representatives, if we were in the US, the whole discussion would be about this. Since then, I haven't stumbled upon any media article discussing European electoral reform. No interest whatsoever from the media about the rules of the game. And I find this absolutely astounding, that nobody has an interest in defining, discussing which are the pros and cons of the different kind of rules we choose in order to select our candidates. I think there's much more to be saying. Perhaps a final note on Northern Ireland, which is clearly an outlier, not only Europe, but as you said, also in the UK. But I think the situation of Northern Ireland now is not so dissimilar from the member, which are members of the European Economic Area. Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, which have a bridge, of course, which is very institutionalized. But in a way, they are also on the receiving end without having the possibility, right, to have a say. On a case-by-case basis, they try to decide whether or not to adopt the policies that the European Union has been deciding. So they have this kind of cherry-picking option, which is happening. But you're absolutely right. It would be interesting to see, and this has to be linked also to candidate countries, to what extent these channels of participation could be somehow open or be used in order to have not necessarily the electoral representation, which is difficult to have if you're not a full member, but you could have access to channels of participation allowing the population to interact with the European institutions that is taking decisions affecting them. I think this would be powerful. And as I said, some of these channels of participation, starting from petitions, but also complaints to the Ombudsman and complaints to the Commission, are open to residents and also inhabitants of, citizens coming from other countries. So you could experiment yourself and try to use them and to see what is going to be considered admissible and opening an entire channel. The entire history of US constitutionalism, it's marked by the use of petitions. So disenfranchised people, slaves, were using petitions in order to bring their instances to the political system and forcing them to take a stance on those issues. There's so much to learn from that experience that we haven't necessarily looked at so far.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for covering the present and the past, as well as the future of European democracy. Very last word from Rosa, and then you are all free to go and jump in the sea before dinner.
Yeah, no, I'll try to be really brief. I mean, just on your point about enlargement and democracy, in theory, that would be a great opportunity. And you know, if an enlarged Europe wants to work, enlarged EU wants to work, it really needs to look at democratic conditionality in a different way. But that has to apply for the current EU members as well. Absolutely. And think about, you know, how to enforce that once the EU has enlarged. I just wanted to say one thing. Boris has gone, so I don't know if he's going to come back. But the principle of subsidiarity means that, you know, you need to deal with certain things at the appropriate level, right? So there are different competences at the local level, at the national level. Here comes Boris. Boris comes back. Yes. So there are different competences, and you know, and I think the key challenge for politicians is actually to explain to citizens where it is appropriate to deal with certain things and where it is appropriate to deal with other things. It's pretty basic, but that's quite important for the functioning of democracy at all the various levels. And then finally, all going to vote at the same time. Gosh, Boris, I mean, this year is the most stressful year that I can think of, 2024, with half the world going to vote. Just imagine if we were to go and vote all at the same time in the EU. That would be really stressful, and I'm not entirely sure that us think tankers would survive.
So I suggest that everybody who has appetite to keep talking about democratic innovation should get together on one table over dinner, and all of those who just don't want to hear any more about it for another 24 hours should get together on the other table, because there's clearly a lot of interest, and it also connects with many of the other issues that we've discussed today. So thank you all very much, and looking forward to seeing you. I think we have to be 8 o'clock on the dot outside Hotel Kimen to go to dinner. And thanks very much, Rob.
Thank you. Thank you very much.